Welcome to Green Building Matters, the original and most popular podcast focused on the green building movement. Your host is Charlie Cicchetti, one of the most credentialed experts in the green building industry and one of the few to be honored as a lead fellow. Each week, Charlie welcomes a green building professional from around the globe to share their war stories, career advice, and unique insight into how sustainability is shaping the built environment. So settle in, grab a fresh cup of coffee, and get ready to find out why green building matters.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Cicchetti. And I love this part of my job because once a week I get to interview someone somewhere in the world that either works in real estate or construction or architecture, but the common denominator is sustainability, a passion for the green building movement. Today, I've got Dean Stanberry with us. He's in the Denver, Colorado area. Dean and I have been getting to know each other over the last several months, and I just love his story. I love his passion towards all things facilities, but also sustainability. So, Dean, looking forward to talking to you today. How's everything?
Great. And thank you for inviting me to join your podcast today. I really enjoy doing these types of discussions and getting to know you too. So,
yeah, no, thanks, Dean. And I know we'll take a look at, over 20 years in facility management, some huge Fortune 100 companies, and you manage many facilities, but also IFMA, and you're still very active there. And for those that don't know, just the trade organization for facility managers, a global reach here. And I know you're passionate about education too. So I'm sure we're going to get into those things, but I ask all of my guests, hey, take us back. Dean, where'd you grow up and go to school?
All right. Well, as Steve Martin said, I started out as a small child. Actually, I grew up in a small farm town of Woodland, which is near Sacramento, California. So what I learned from my hometown experience was everything that I did not want to do for the rest of my life. Although I did start working at an early age. I was a diesel mechanic, a welder, a painter by the time I was in high school. And those experiences really would serve me well kind of later in life, but that didn't turn out to be, part of my larger career. There was not much to do in Woodland except drinking and drag racing. And consequently, I graduated high school with 2 cars and 3 motorcycles. I was a big music fan. Woodland is about 70 miles from San Francisco. So once I had my driver's license, I spent most weekends at Winterland in the Fillmore West seeing all those rock bands that are now considered classic rock category. So yeah, that was it. I had hot rods. I raced motocross when I was in school. And that was my ill-spent youth.
Oh, my gosh. I love that. And, when it came time to say, okay, where do I want to do some studies, maybe get some university work in, what was weighing on you? Did you know what you wanted to do, or how were those conversations going at the time?
No, I kind of wandered around a little bit. So, when we talked about, sustainability, I really didn't get interested in sustainability until about the early 2000s when USGBC and LEED were first emerging. And honestly, I hadn't paid really much attention to things like climate change or sustainability up to that point. After all, one of my cars in high school got 4 miles to the gallon if I didn't put my foot into it. So as I learned, though, about sustainability was more than just, saving on energy costs. I really became a sustainability advocate and now consider myself a climate activist. So, as far as like my influences, I left California about in the mid 1970s and moved to Southern Oregon. And at first I was just driving a forklift in a lumber mill, but that was really mind-numbing work. And I really wanted more. And I started applying for jobs in what was considered, stable career opportunities like the power company and the phone company at the time. And I ended up getting hired by the phone company, which was Pacific Northwest Bell, and started working in the business office. That really didn't last too long because I developed an interest in information systems. But remember, at that time, this was several years before the IBM PC even came out. So I just got interested in IT, and I ended up transitioning into the IT organization, which led me to Portland, Oregon, and then eventually to Seattle, Washington. And it was in Seattle where my career really started to take off. I had the opportunity to work with or for some very intelligent executives and thought leaders. And while these were not like formal mentor relationships, I just feel very fortunate to have grown up in a corporate structure that really valued developing the next generation of organizational leaders. So much of what I absorbed during that period of my career, I still value today and utilize it on a daily basis. So that, most of my education was really in the corporate world and not in a formal education setting. Although I attended universities and colleges every place that I lived. I kept getting moved around, so I never actually got enough credits to get a degree.
I saw several certificates from some really cool places too along the way, like you're saying, and sometimes the big corporate amazing training, or like you said, some brilliant minds you had access to. So really got some good hands-on training there. So yeah, I do ask about mentors. You mentioned some influences, and maybe as you start shifting your career, I'm curious towards real estate, facilities, later sustainability. But is there anyone else you might call either a mentor or someone you did look up to along the way?
I actually had several people. I worked for a gentleman. This was all at the phone company, US West. We had a VP of our advanced software development. He had a PhD in software engineering, but he was one of the nicest people that you would ever meet. Very empathetic, very caring. That doesn't always go with the PhD because those people sometimes get a little focused in their activities. And then I was also fortunate to work directly for the chief information officer of US West, a guy by the name of Dave Lobby. Dave was actually a finance guy by training, but he ended up becoming the CIO of the company. He kind of had a thing for IT as well. And I learned a lot from him because I learned a lot about finance, necessarily because he was brought in to actually kind of put some controls around the IT and the finance spending. And part of that, we had to spin off our actually technology company into its own corporate entity. This had to do with the regulated monopoly of the phone company. And we had multiple companies that we were supporting. So we couldn't do that as part of the regulated monopoly. We had to create a separate entity. And I and one other person actually did the work to create a corporate entity that was $1.2 billion on day one and had 7,000 employees.
It's a good start.
Yeah. So that was an interesting exercise. I learned things about, treasury and some other things that I was like, never would have come across that in my career probably. But I got to learn a lot about, how do these things actually work? How do you form them? And the one objective we almost met, not quite. He said, I don't want this to disrupt any of the employees. It should be just totally transparent. It's just going to change the label up on the corner of their paycheck, to a different corporate name. And the only thing that we couldn't do is that when we created this new entity, we had to collect I-9 forms from everybody. And remember, phone company, most people were career lifers. So people had been there for 20, 25, 30 years, long before I-9s were ever required. So that was the one thing we could not get away from, is we had to go out and get people. About literally 2/3 of the population had to sign I-9s because they didn't have one on file.
Oh my gosh, that's wild. Yeah, a lot of career loyalty there. And you were there 20, 22 years. Let's fast forward a little bit. 2002. So Johnson Controls, starting to get into buildings and facilities. So kind of what changed, and tell us a little bit about that part of your career. How'd you get more into the facilities, construction, real estate side?
Well, the facility management is called the accidental profession. And I know exactly when my accident happened. And it actually happened when I started at the phone company. So I ran data centers, big mainframe data centers, and then went on to work in our advanced technologies group. And I was working for this CIO, as I mentioned, as a staff manager, which meant I did everything that nobody else wanted to do. And one day the real estate guys came around and said, to all the business unit leaders, and said, we're going to give you back responsibility for the space that your department occupies. And so you need to get somebody to manage that. And so Dave looks over at me and goes, you used to run data centers. That's kind of like real estate. Here, take this. And so I looked at him and said, oh, okay. Because I just did whatever he asked me to do. And I said, well, what do we got? And he goes, I don't know. Go ask the real estate guys. And in that moment, what I found out is I inherited 5 million square feet of administrative space, 1.5 million square feet of data centers, and a whole bunch of people spread across 14 states. And I went back and said, this is kind of a full-time job, right? And he goes, well, just go figure out what it really needs and then we'll deal with it. So I did end up keeping that responsibility. And that's when I figured out, I knew critical infrastructure. I knew data centers. I knew how to operate them. I knew all of the buildings and the facility part of that, but not so much office buildings. And that's when I actually went out and I found IFMA. And I joined IFMA and started taking some classes around, just basically facility management as a function, as a career. And, that's kind of when I got into it. And as it turned out, when US West was bought by a company called Quest, I left about 2 weeks after that occurred because I knew that was not going to be a fun time. And actually the CIO ended up leaving too. He decided he didn't want to work for the guy that was taken over. And so I just kept going in facilities. I was actually brought into a startup company to run their real estate and facilities. Unfortunately, this was like around close to the 2000s. And that company did not survive the .com bust. But I still stayed with facilities after that and just continued on.
And then that's when you got involved in life. So let's talk about just, maybe if you can name them, some of the really cool facilities you've kind of had a hand in over the years. Are there any kind of highlights along the way as you look back? So it's kind of a two-part question. What you can talk about, what kind of cool facilities. You mentioned some incredible data centers, but any clients you could name / let's look back. What are some other things you're real proud of?
Well, let's see. Again, going back to the phone company, when I had that real estate responsibility, we wanted to consolidate some of our software development because in Denver, we had IT people in 19 different buildings. So they were scattered all over the place. And many cases, this was long before we had, pervasive, even conferencing facilities. So every time there was a meeting, somebody'd have to get up, leave the building, go to another building. And, it was a lot of wasted time. So we wanted to consolidate a bunch of people into one space. And we leased a new property and I, managed the renovation and created basically a software development center for about 700 people. And it had great conferencing space, or at the time, really state of the art, divided conference rooms. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, whiteboard, because everybody likes to, get up and draw with a marker. We had great video capabilities and, audio conferencing capabilities. That space, they were concerned because it was outside of downtown Denver. And they said, well, we're going to lose people. And I said, I don't think so, because, they're having to pay a lot of money to park downtown right now. This is free parking. And by the way, it's right across the street from a RTD transit center. So, people can, take the bus if they don't want to drive and all of that. And so after we moved everybody in, I went back to all of the VPs that were concerned. And I said, how many people did you lose? And the answer was 0. And they all were happy because it was brand new furniture. They were in buildings that were, decades old, and the furniture was decades old. So most of it was pretty tired. This was all brand new, state of the art kind of stuff. So they were happy.
I love it.
Yeah, I worked for a small software development company that had healthcare systems, and they had buildings all over the U.S. They kept buying companies, but they were headquartered in Newport Beach, California. Newport Beach has not one but 2 of the most expensive zip codes in the U.S. And the headquarters was in Newport Beach because the CEO could practically throw a rock and hit his house. But it was a small building and they wanted to do a renovation, and we got to renovate this. It was really just the C-suite. There was only about 20 or so people in that office, but we renovated that to be a true headquarters, again, state of the art, video conferencing, conference rooms, new furniture, just some really cool stuff that we were able to do in this tiny little horseshoe-shaped building. And that turned out really well. That was a fun project. And I got to work on another project, same company. They bought a company that was based out of Boston. And that company had already signed a lease for the 42nd floor of the John Hancock Tower in the Back Bay of Boston.
Oh, wow.
And we kind of questioned, it's like, these are blue collar software developers. What are you doing in some of the most expensive real estate in the Back Bay of Boston? But, I had to renovate that floor. That one was a challenging project, however, because the tenant that had been there before had been there for 27 years. And lots had changed in terms of building code. So as we're going in there, we had to upgrade all fire suppression systems to the latest code. They decided they wanted to put a small data center on that floor. There was not enough power on that floor to do that. So that was a challenge. Not enough cooling from the chilled water loop was available for the data center. So lots of little challenges to overcome that nobody thought of when they signed the lease. They just signed the paper. And actually what it was is somebody walked out, looked at the view outside of the 42nd floor and said, "We'll take it."
What a view. Man, I love these stories. I can tell you've loved to problem solve along the way. All these buildings, who knows what you're getting. To our listeners, we've got some architects, engineers, contractors, and real estate professionals listening. So, Dean, can you clear up high level? What's the difference between like a facility manager and say like a property manager and a building engineer, maybe on the multi-tenant for rent side versus maybe an owner-occupied property? How do you differentiate between those roles?
There is a small differentiation when we talk about property management. So generally, we're talking about multi-tenant buildings, high rises, that kind of thing. So a property manager in the state of Colorado, for example, a property manager has to have a real estate license as well because they're discussing lease terms with tenants. Now, it isn't required everywhere, but in Colorado it is. And if you're a property manager, you also deal probably with finance a little more because you're also doing invoices for those tenants. You have to understand, common area maintenance charges and all those kind of things. You got to be able to explain it to the tenants and, you have to review them and make sure that they're accurate and so forth. So you don't want the tenants coming back to make you, to audit you for years on end. But when you come to the basic responsibilities, so a facility manager, property manager is still dealing with core and shell, still dealing with primary building systems. Most property managers don't deal with the interiors because that is the tenant's responsibility. So a facility manager is likely going to do property managers and facility managers. If they own the building, they're dealing with the facade, the exteriors, the landscape, all of those kind of things that go along with it. So it really depends. Facility management as well. If you think about it, every building, no matter what its purpose, has a facility manager that is responsible for it. So we're talking hospitality, healthcare, to standard office buildings, could be manufacturing, whatever types of buildings are out there, you've got a facility manager. So there's a lot of responsibilities, core competencies that are the same, but each one is going to have a slightly different, maybe priority over it. When you go to healthcare, obviously there's a lot of, it's typically a hospital is a 7x24 facility. You've got all these emergency systems. You're dealing with gases, and things like that you have to deal with. So those are a little different. Yeah. Where you might have an engineer, you might see that more in a manufacturing setting where, there's a lot of specialized equipment. So they typically want maybe a professional engineer involved that has a little more of that engineering background to help with the operation, the day-to-day and things like that. So that's kind of the range of what in facility management.
Super helpful, man. Thank you. I know that's a frequently asked question. All right, next I want to talk about IFMA and especially some of the cool education and topics you're trying to make sure IFMA as an organization is out in front on. So Dean, I know you're the first vice chair on the global board of directors at, the International Facility Managers Association here. So if you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing with your involvement with IFMA, but then I'd really love for you to tell our audience a little more about some of these really interesting sustainability topics you're trying to make sure get to all these facility managers.
Okay, well, let me just start with, so IFMA offers 3 certifications. So we have 2 certificates and 1 credential. We call the entry-level one the Facility Management Professional, or FMP. That's a certificate. So you basically take the classes. Once you get the certificate, you're done. You can put the letters after your name and you don't have to recertify. We also created the Sustainability Facility Professional, which is SFP. That's another certificate. And I would say it has a similarity to the lead AP for operations and maintenance, except the lead AP O&M does not teach you how to operate a building. I actually have that credential, and it teaches you how to certify the building. It doesn't teach the individual how to operate the building ongoing. So IFMA saw that as a gap, and that we took it's a lot of the same content when you look at it, because you're still teaching people about sustainability. The difference is that we're focusing more on how do you apply this in an operational context, year over year. And so that's what the SFP does. And then the last is our certified facility manager. That is a credential. That is a competency-based credential. So you need about 3 to 5 years of experience before you even, take that exam, because, you wouldn't pass it just by trying to cram through from a textbook like you do with the other ones. The FMP, the SFP, and even the LEED credentials are all knowledge-based. So basically, you read the books, you cram for the exam, you can pass the exam. And the CFM is, you have to renew that every 3 years, much like a CPA or something like that has to renew their credentials. You have to renew the CFM. And I know that because I have my CFM and I actually have to renew mine in December. So coming right up.
So these are the credentials, and it's good for everyone to know, look into these more. And then I think you're trying to build on it too with your involvement. I think you have a special committee. Hey, what are some of these green building trends and just how do we make sure this gets to your audience, but not your traditional education, right? You really want to make it hands-on. And can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the, there's a lot of things that have been evolving over I would say last 3 to 5 years, some maybe a little longer, but mostly 3 to 5 years. And so these were coming at us pretty quickly and a lot of people getting really interested in it. And we said, well, we need to understand how some of these things really apply to the facility management profession. So we created an emerging topics working group that I chair. And the 5 topics that we're including are circular economy, climate change, ESG reporting, prop tech, and the workplace wellness and well-being. And so we have subgroups within the larger working group that are addressing each one of those. And, our first objective is understanding how will this impact or influence the FM profession? What do we need to know? What does the FM need to know? And when do they need to know it? What level of knowledge do they need to have? So things like circular economy, which is far more advanced in Europe than it is in the US, that's still very much an unknown area for most people. So that's really building awareness. We want to at least build the awareness. What is circular economy? Why do you need to care? When do we think it's really going to start impacting the U.S., facility managers? The people in Europe, it's already there. Climate change, we have a couple of papers that we put out on, climate change fundamentals for facility managers. And we tried to take, the IPCC report and the NC4 report, and that's 3,000 pages of dense scientific material. We boiled it down to about 30 pages. I said, these are the key points you need to know. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to know this stuff. And then we produced another paper on adapting to climate change. So that is really about how do you do a climate risk assessment? And then based on those results and what risks you may have, where do you find information about that, whether it's floods or temperature or drought or whatever? Where do you find additional information on adapting, mitigating, avoiding, or accepting those climate risks? So that's kind of where we're at. Prop tech is one that's been around a little longer. We've been getting inundated by new technology, sensor data. Where the industry is really going through digital transformation. And commercial real estate is probably the last industry to go digital. And as a result, many people across all roles have pretty low technical skills and experiences. So when you start talking to people about data characteristics or data analytics or data governance, you get a lot of blank stares. But that's really where we're going. We're becoming a data-driven industry. And so we really need to raise the bar for, many people in the professions. Doesn't matter which role you have, you need to understand more about this stuff. And that's going to play very much heavily into ESG reporting. The E part in particular, where, environment is going to be a big component for facility managers. And the big difference is that now, the whole point of ESG is that it is auditable. And so any data that we're providing that's going to go into an ESG report, we must be able to audit it and prove its validity and the credibility. So that's not something that we've really dealt with before in terms of, performance data. Financials, yes, but things like, your carbon footprint, carbon emissions and things like that, this is new territory. So that is the things that we're trying to work on and say, these are the things we need to build the awareness and then start building the knowledge level within the profession.
You're nailing it. Those are the right topics. And now kind of carbon accounting, if you will, it's just so important. Well, I also want to talk to you about the GSA, the General Services Administration. I know as you've done consulting and other committee work over the last several years, you've been heavily involved here. We see here in the U.S., we've got some international listeners. Thank you. The Inflation Reduction Act, and we've got the federal buildings trying to decarbonize. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the work you do there to support the GSA and maybe how that's starting to line up even with some of the decarbonization there?
Certainly. I mean, I'm a contractor, so I'm not a GSA employee. I was brought in to actually help do some work on their computerized maintenance management system, which they put in a national system 7 or 8 years ago now. And, it's got some data quality issues. There's some training and adoption issues. I would say, what one of the issues, the main issue was, I don't think they recognized that they were really making a fundamental change in culture and behavior by adopting a national. They were taking something and people that have been doing the same thing the same way for 20 years and telling them, now you're going to do it different. And so it was really kind of painting the picture and saying, this is really, you're changing the culture of the organization. You're going to become an asset-driven culture, and that's very different. So you need to not just train people on the tool, because that's the simple part. You need to train them on why we're doing this. What's the imperative? And we have to train all the people right down to the maintenance mechanics, because they're the ones that are putting the data into the tool when it comes to maintenance. That's all the information that actually you take that data, turn it into insight, And so that's been an interesting project that I've worked on. We've made some progress. We got a ways to go, but GSA is really, I think, the world's largest landlord, to the best of my knowledge, 370 million square feet. So it's a large portfolio. Half of that's leased. The other half is owned. And the half they own, they operate. The leases are pretty much full service leases. So they let the landlord deal with those. And a large chunk of these buildings are historic buildings. They're 100-year-old buildings. So there's a lot of uniqueness and a lot of components about federal facilities. And IFMA does a lot of work with DOE and some of the national labs. And of course, that flows into GSA at various points as well. So some of the work that I've been doing with DOE and some of their technology campaigns, I've been bringing that in and, showing it to some people in GSA and getting them interested in it, maybe a little sooner than they might have through normal mechanisms. They're actually going to go through their version of decarbonization with the IRA money. There's a project that's under development that is really going to look at trying to do some pilot buildings to become net zero for the, federal properties. So that's under development right now. So I really can't say too much about that. I don't really have direct involvement, but I know some of the people that are working on it. So I have a little bit of insight, but that's kind of where, they are taking it seriously. They are trying to find definitely the most opportune ways to spend that money. The GSA administrator actually at Greenbuild made a statement that said, none of this money will be spent on fossil fuel driven technologies. So that was a pretty big statement. So there's a lot of people now trying to figure out how are we going to electrify things in some very old buildings that it's got them causing some sleepless nights, I'm sure.
Well, that's a huge footprint. Thank you for sharing and how you're helping here with these initiatives. Let's look to the future. Let's say you had a crystal ball. What are you kind of excited about coming down the road in this green building movement?
I think I believe that sustainability and green buildings are really pivoting to a primary objective of decarbonization. In the past, it's been energy efficiency, which in most people that just meant, well, we're going to reduce our energy bill. We're going to reduce cost. But it really wasn't about reducing emissions. And so that is a huge shift, I think. I think in many ways, we're being swept up in the massive digital transformation that's really spanning all industries, not just commercial real estate. It's just that commercial real estate is one of the last ones to go digital. So I think Korea is really struggling a little bit to adapt and adopt to that transformation. And then, of course, the evolution of ESG. So its predecessor was corporate social responsibility. But again, there was no standards. There was no auditing. Anybody could put anything they wanted in their CSR report. And many of them were basically proven to be just nothing but greenwashing. And so ESG is an attempt to put a little more credibility behind it and transparency. So whatever you put in that ESG report can be verified and it's truth, not just, fiction in many cases. Everybody has their plan to be net zero by 2050, except, large chunk of those plans don't start until the middle of 2049.
And then it's too late. Got to start now. Time is of the essence. And I agree with you. It's all shifted to not just efficiency a little better. It's no decarbonization and hurry it up. And you can reap the energy saving benefits and the operating cost benefits along the way, but let's hurry it up. Don't wait. So that's what I'm hearing, Dean. Well, I'd love to kind of do some rapid fire questions here. Let our audience get to know you a little more. I had an incredible career here, still going on so many fronts and having some great influence. What would you say is your specialty or gift?
I'd say it's a quality improvement, process management mindset. I had the opportunity to get some in-depth training on quality and process techniques over 30 years ago now. And I've used those methodologies almost daily ever since. So having a plan is one level of detail, but do you have a repeatable and measurable process? I don't know I don't recall who said it, but I often repeat this quote that says, strategy without execution was just a good idea. And so, adding to that, execution without a means to measure it and the result is really a lost opportunity. Because if you put a process in place and you're not actually measuring whether that process made a difference anywhere, then, that's a lost opportunity. The whole plan, do, check, and act. Quality is continuous improvement, right? So over time, everything can be improved. Nothing is ever perfect. So you can get it to a point where you say, okay, that's good enough for now. But over time, you're going to go back and say, okay, I think we need to improve this a little more now. So yeah, we'll never be done with that. That's never having to say you're finished.
That's good stuff, man. Thank you. A lot of wisdom here today. Do you have any good habits, routines, rituals?
Coffee.
Any particular brand? Just a good coffee?
I got, Starbucks French roast.
All right, there we go.
I like it fully leaded and yeah.
Pro tip. I love it. You obviously learn a lot about this industry, this evolving industry. Do you read certain articles, resources, listen? How do you like to consume new information? Give us a peek into that side of you.
Most of my reading is really for professional development or generally expanding my knowledge. So I don't have a lot of, what I call, pleasure reading. I don't read like or just fiction and that kind of stuff. One of the books that I read recently, it's both fascinating and terrifying, and it's called Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It. It's by a guy named Robert Glennon. Robert is actually one of the leading water policy experts in the U.S.
Wow.
And he actually spoke at an IFMA event here a couple of years ago now in Orlando. And I got to introduce him and got to know him a little bit. So it was, and I got the book and read it. And I thought, oh my God, we spend a lot of time and effort discussing, energy and carbon emissions, but, not much about really the looming water crisis. We all know about the mega droughts across the U.S. and droughts affecting other parts of the world, but we don't tend to think about water being a concern. After all, it covers 71% of the earth, right? Everybody goes, hey, we got plenty of water. But it's not the fresh water we need to sustain human existence, which is only 2.5% of the Earth's total water. So you start putting that into context and it makes it a little bit more real. All the fresh water that's ever existed still exists today. It's just not necessarily where we need it and when we need it and in the volumes that we need it. And the vast majority of water goes towards agriculture. About 70% goes towards agriculture, which of course is our food supply. So we absolutely need it for that. But when you look around where the areas that were incurring drought, which is California, a lot of agricultural areas that cannot grow enough food or enough crops anymore, and it's moving to other areas. And places where we used to be able to grow corn, the temperature has changed enough that corn no longer grows well in those areas. So now you have to move it to another area. So we need to kind of quickly revise how we manage our water, or we'll never make it to 2050 to see how we met our net zero goals.
Hey, what a good book recommendation. And then just kind of showing us where we can connect it just outside of our normal buildings. Like, gosh, there's so much more to what we've got to correct here. So thank you for that. So bucket list, Dean, as you and I get to know each other more, I'm a fan of the bucket list. So what are one or two things maybe on your bucket list?
I can't say this was on my bucket list, but I will become the chairman of IFMA's Global Board of Directors in July of 2023.
Amazing.
It's an incredible honor and a privilege, and I think it's the greatest achievement of my professional career. So it's something I never imagined in my wildest dreams that I would, get to do that. But through circumstances and maybe just persistence, it will happen, and I'm just very proud of that fact. On my actual bucket list, my wife and I really want to do more international travel. We actually got to live in Europe or in London for a year right after we got married, actually. And we have done some travel, but we haven't gone all the places that we want to go. So there's definitely that list of countries where we want to enjoy sort of the global cultural diversity and just learn more about this planet that we live on.
Man, this is fantastic. We didn't connect all the dots on how you got to Colorado, but you're on the West Coast and Pacific Northwest and Colorado, so you've been living in some pretty neat places. But, what are a couple others, though, you definitely want to travel to? Where do you want to go?
Well, my wife wants to go to Spain and Portugal. That's been on her top of her list for a while. So that's like one of the ones we got to get to. We love Hawaii. We actually have a condo on Kaanapali Beach on Maui, but we don't get to go there nearly enough. So, one of those things is at some point we actually would like to go there and spend, 3 or 4 months, maybe like when it gets really freaking cold here in Colorado, we can go sit on the beach.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome.
So, we try to go there as often as we can. It's a vacation rental when we're not using it. But some of the other places, I would love, and I'll probably get the opportunity because IFMA is an international organization. I'd love to go to Hong Kong, Shanghai, or, visit those places. I have colleagues in Australia, New Zealand, that they keep going, come on down, you can stay with us. We have second vice chair is actually from Brazil. He lives in Sao Paulo, wants us to come down and visit Sao Paulo. We have colleagues in Amsterdam and Copenhagen and, other parts of Europe. We've been to France. My wife's family is actually family history is Germany. And so we definitely want to go spend a little bit of time in Germany. And we've been to Italy and France and places like that. So I just want to expand a little bit more. I'm not too much on some of the places where, if you have to go someplace and they say it's best if you stay on the resort, it's like,
right.
That's probably not
venture out a little bit. We'll get that passport ready, man. Thanks for giving us a peek into those destinations. It's exciting times. Last couple of questions. One is, if you look back on your career, anything you wish you'd have known a little earlier?
I had a couple of thoughts on that. Where did I put that? I think when I look back, I wished I would have started my career maybe earlier because I kind of had a crooked road to get where I'm at. I didn't really start off that early. I was probably in my early 30s when I think I really started, getting serious. So I probably could have accomplished more if I would have started a little bit earlier, but that's not the way it worked out. So, that's the one thing that I would say, I wished I would have started earlier. I actually do not have a degree. I've been to a lot of schools. I do have a certificate in project management. I've actually studied, information systems and facilities and things, but I kept getting relocated as part of my career at the phone company. And I wasn't in any one place long enough to, finish up a degree, and I'd go someplace else and have to take a step back and start over. And at some point, working 60, 70-hour weeks, I kind of said, I just can't continue to, do school and put in the hours as well. So a little bit of a workaholic, that I would say advice to some people is, try to find that work-life balance. I'm a Virgo, so a perfectionist. Both my wife and I are Virgos and perfectionists, and just in different things. And so, I'm always focused on, getting it not just done, but done right and done on time and with quality and all that. And sometimes that's hard to do and still maintain a good work-life balance.
Hey, well said. Thank you. All right, last question. Let's say someone's listening, they're getting inspired hearing your story, and they're just now jumping into this green building movement. Any words of encouragement for them?
There's a quote that I love. It's actually attributed to Arthur Ashe, the American tennis player. And it goes, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I think more than anything, that is so appropriate for sustainability and climate action, because it doesn't matter when you start. It just matters that you do start.
Man, we're going to end on that. That was incredible. Hadn't heard the quote quite like that. I didn't know it was Arthur Ashe. Thank you for inspiring us today, Dean. Everybody connect with Dean on LinkedIn. Make sure you let him know what you thought of the podcast interview. And I just appreciate our growing relationship, Dean. And thanks for everything you've done for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate being on today.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.